6 months from today, your life could look completely different. You could be stronger, more focused, more confident, and moving with a clear sense of direction. Or 6 months could pass exactly the way the last 6 months did. Quietly, quickly, almost without you noticing. Time has a strange way of moving like that. At first it feels slow. A single day seems long. But when you look back, the weeks blur together. The months disappear faster than you expected. And suddenly you realize another year has gone by while most things in your life stayed exactly the same. Not because you didn't care. Not because you didn't have dreams or goals, but because your time, your attention, and your energy were constantly pulled in 100 different directions. You wake up, you check your phone, messages, notifications, emails, social media. You tell yourself it will only take a few minutes, but somehow those minutes stretch into half an hour. Then the day moves forward, filled with responsibilities, conversations, tasks, and small distractions that quietly consume your focus. By the time the evening arrives, you're tired. Maybe you scroll a little more. Watch something to relax. Promise yourself that tomorrow will be the day you start making real progress, but tomorrow often looks a lot like today. And every once in a while, during a quiet moment, a thought appears. What if my life could be more than this? Not necessarily more dramatic, not necessarily more complicated, just more intentional, more focused, more aligned with the person you know you could become. A few years ago, a close friend of mine reached that exact point. From the outside, so his life looked completely normal. Stable job, regular routine, weekends with friends. Nothing seemed wrong, but one evening during a long conversation, he admitted something honest. He said, "I feel like I'm capable of more, but I keep wasting the time that could get me there." A few days later, he made a quiet decision. For the next 6 months, he would stop trying to keep up with everything and everyone. He would step back from most distractions and focus on rebuilding himself. He reduced his social media to almost nothing. He began waking up earlier. He exercised regularly, read books every day, and spent his evenings learning skills that could actually move his life forward. At first, nobody noticed, but slowly, something began to change. His discipline grew stronger, his thinking became clearer, and his confidence became calmer and deeper. Opportunities started appearing where they hadn't before. 6 months later, the difference was obvious. He didn't suddenly become a different person, but he had finally become a stronger version of the person he always had the potential to be. And that's the interesting thing about real transformation. It rarely happens in front of an audience. Most growth takes place quietly, during the months when you're focused, patient, and working on yourself, while no one else is paying attention. This audiobook is about that quiet transformation. Over the next hour, we'll explore what can happen when you step away from constant distractions and give yourself the space to focus deeply on your own growth. Because the next 6 months will pass, no matter what you do. The real question is who you will become when those 6 months are over. And before we begin, think about someone in your life who might need to hear this message right now. A friend, a sibling, or someone who feels stuck and ready for a new direction. Send this video to them. Sometimes the right idea, heard at the right moment, can quietly change the course of a person's life. Chapter 1. The silent battle for your attention. Most people believe their biggest obstacle in life is a lack of opportunity. They assume success belongs to people who are simply given better chances, better connections, or better timing. And on the surface, that explanation feels reasonable. If the problem is external, then there isn't much we can do about it. But in reality, the modern world presents more opportunity than any previous generation has ever had. Information is everywhere. Skills can be learned online. Entire careers can be built from a laptop. Knowledge that once required years inside universities is now accessible to anyone with curiosity and discipline. So if opportunity has increased, why do so many people still feel stuck? The answer is something far less visible. The real battle today is not for opportunity. It's for your attention. Every day, thousands of companies compete for the same limited resource inside your mind. Social media platforms, news feeds, streaming services, advertisements, notifications, and short videos are all designed with one goal in mind: capturing your focus and keeping it for as long as possible. Individually, none of these distractions seem dangerous. Checking your phone for a minute doesn't feel harmful. Watching a short video doesn't feel like a big deal. Responding to a quick message seems harmless. But when these small interruptions repeat dozens of times a day, something subtle begins to happen. Your focus fragments, your thinking becomes shallower, and the ability to work deeply on something meaningful slowly disappears. And a colleague of mine named Daniel discovered this in a way that caught him completely off guard. Daniel worked in marketing, and from the outside he seemed incredibly productive. His calendar was always full of meetings. His phone buzzed constantly. He responded quickly to emails, stayed active in every group chat, and always seemed aware of the latest online trends. If someone asked whether Daniel was busy, the answer would always be yes. But one afternoon, during a quiet break at the office, he leaned back in his chair and said something unexpected. "I feel like my brain is exhausted all the time," he admitted. "But when I think about what I actually accomplished this week, I'm not sure it was anything important." At first, it sounded like simple frustration. Everyone feels overwhelmed sometimes. But later that evening, curiosity pushed him to check something he had never really paid attention to before: his phone's weekly screen time report. The number surprised him. His phone usage averaged nearly 5 hours a day. 5 hours. Not on work, not on meaningful learning. Most of that time had been scattered across social media feeds, short videos, random articles, and endless message threads. The moment became even more uncomfortable when he remembered something that had happened earlier that week. He had been standing in the elevator on the way up to the office, holding his phone in one hand and scrolling through short videos. The elevator ride lasted less than a minute. When the doors opened, he realized he had already watched 3 videos without even remembering what they were about. It had happened automatically, almost unconsciously. And when Daniel looked back at the screen time numbers, he began doing the math. 5 hours a day, 35 hours a week. That's nearly an entire full-time job spent simply consuming information and entertainment. Over a month, those hours added up to roughly 140 hours. And over the course of 6 months, that meant more than 800 hours of attention had quietly disappeared into distractions. 800 hours. Imagine investing even half of that time into something meaningful. Learning a valuable skill, building physical strength, reading powerful ideas, developing discipline, creating something that actually moves your life forward. That realization unsettled him more than he expected, because it forced him to confront a difficult possibility. Maybe the biggest obstacle in his life wasn't a lack of time or opportunity. Maybe it was the constant noise surrounding him. Psychologists sometimes describe this phenomenon as attention residue. Every time you switch tasks, part of your mind remains attached to the previous activity. If you check a message while working, a portion of your thoughts continues thinking about that conversation even after you return to your task. The more frequently you switch, the more scattered your attention becomes. And when attention becomes scattered, deep thinking becomes nearly impossible. You might spend an entire day feeling busy, yet reach the evening unable to point to anything meaningful you actually completed. This pattern is far more common than most people realize. Modern life quietly trains us to jump between tasks every few minutes. Notifications interrupt our focus. New information constantly appears. The brain becomes addicted to small bursts of novelty and stimulation. Over time, stillness starts to feel uncomfortable. Silence feels strange, and focused effort begins to feel unusually difficult. But Daniel decided to try a small experiment. Nothing dramatic. No extreme rules. He simply protected 2 hours of his day. 2 hours with no social media, no notifications, no phone within reach, just uninterrupted focus. The first few days felt surprisingly difficult. His instinct was to reach for his phone every few minutes. Sometimes he caught himself unlocking the screen without even realizing why. But slowly, something began to change. His mind started calming down, and tasks that once felt overwhelming became easier to approach. He could read longer without losing concentration. Ideas appeared more naturally because his thoughts were no longer constantly interrupted. After a few weeks, those 2 quiet hours became the most productive part of his entire day. And after a few months, the results began to show in ways he hadn't expected. But what surprised him most wasn't just the productivity, it was the clarity. For the first time in years, his mind wasn't constantly racing between dozens of unfinished thoughts. That clarity would soon lead him to make a much bigger decision, one that would shape the next 6 months of his life in ways he never anticipated. Chapter 2. Why most people never experience deep focus. Daniel's small experiment with 2 hours of uninterrupted focus began to change something inside his mind. At first, the difference felt subtle. He simply noticed that tasks which used to feel overwhelming were suddenly easier to begin. But after a few weeks, something else became clear. The difficulty he had always felt when trying to concentrate was never really about discipline. It was about conditioning. For years, his brain had been trained to expect constant stimulation. Every notification, every new message, every short video delivered a quick burst of novelty. The brain learned to crave that feeling. Over time, anything that required slow concentration, reading a book, studying a complex idea, working through a difficult problem, started to feel unusually uncomfortable. Daniel was not alone. Most people today have unknowingly trained their minds in the same way. A professor at a university once ran a simple experiment with his students. At the beginning of the class, he asked everyone to place their phones on their desks, face down, and promise not to touch them for the next 20 minutes. The assignment seemed easy. After all, 20 minutes is not a long time. But something interesting began to happen. Within just a few minutes, many of the students started shifting in their seats. Some tapped their fingers on the desk. Others stared at their phones as if expecting them to light up at any moment. One student eventually raised his hand and said something honest. "I keep thinking my phone vibrated," he said, even though it hadn't. The room laughed, but the professor nodded. "Oh, that feeling has a name," he explained. "It's called phantom vibration syndrome. The brain becomes so accustomed to checking the phone that it begins imagining notifications that aren't even there." When Daniel first heard about that experiment, he laughed too. But then he remembered the elevator moment earlier that week, the automatic scrolling, the feeling that he had opened his phone without even deciding to do it. That realization forced him to look at his habits differently. Most people assume focus is simply a matter of willpower. They believe disciplined individuals possess some special internal strength that allows them to concentrate while others cannot. But in reality, focus behaves more like a muscle. If you constantly interrupt it, it weakens. If you train it patiently, it grows stronger. Unfortunately, modern life rarely encourages that kind of training. Open your phone for a moment and notice what happens. Every application is carefully designed to keep your attention moving. New content loads instantly. Videos start automatically. Notifications appear at unpredictable moments, creating a sense of urgency. Each element encourages quick reactions rather than deep thinking. And the more time someone spends in that environment, the harder it becomes to sit quietly with a single task. A friend of Daniel's experienced this in a surprising way. Her name was Lisa, and she worked as a graphic designer. For years, she had considered herself a creative person, but gradually, she began feeling as though her creativity had disappeared. Whenever she tried to work on a new design project, she struggled to stay focused for more than 15 minutes. So her attention drifted toward her phone, her email, or some new idea she felt compelled to check online. At first, she believed the problem was burnout. Maybe she just needed inspiration. Maybe she needed a vacation. But during one conversation with Daniel, she tried a simple experiment. For one evening, She turned off all notifications and left her phone in another room while working on a design project. The first 30 minutes felt strangely uncomfortable. She found herself standing up, walking around, and looking for small excuses to check something online. But eventually, something shifted. Her mind began to settle. Ideas that had felt blocked started appearing again. She became absorbed in the details of the design. Colors, shapes, and layouts began forming naturally. 3 hours passed before she even realized it. When she finished, she looked at the clock in disbelief. She hadn't worked with that level of concentration in years. Experiences like that reveal an important truth. Deep focus is not something mysterious. It is something most people have simply forgotten how to access. Children demonstrate this ability naturally. When a child becomes absorbed in building something, drawing or solving a puzzle, they can spend long stretches of time completely immersed in the activity. But as life becomes more connected and more distracted, that natural ability slowly fades. Notifications interrupt the mind. Multitasking becomes normal. Silence becomes rare. And eventually, many adults begin believing they simply aren't good at focusing. But the truth is simpler. Their attention has been trained to scatter. The good news is that attention can be retrained. Every time a person chooses to work without interruption, even for a short period of time, the brain begins adapting. Neural pathways associated with concentration grow stronger. The urge to check distractions gradually weakens. At first, the process feels difficult, but with consistency, something powerful begins to happen. Focus returns, and when focus returns, time begins to feel different. A single hour of deep work can accomplish more than an entire day of fragmented attention. For Daniel, those protected 2 hours each day became a turning point. They created a quiet space where his mind could finally operate without constant interference. But after several months, he began realizing something even more interesting. If 2 hours of focus could change so much, what would happen if he extended that idea much further? What would happen if, instead of protecting just a small part of the day, he stepped away from the noise of constant distraction for a much longer period of time? That question would soon lead him toward a decision that few people are willing to make. Chapter 3. The Decision to Disappear. By the time Daniel had spent several months protecting those 2 hours of uninterrupted focus each day, something inside him had already begun to shift. At first, the change was mostly internal. His thoughts felt clearer. He could approach problems without feeling overwhelmed. Tasks that once dragged on for days now moved forward with steady progress. But slowly, the changes began appearing in other parts of his life as well. He started waking up earlier, not because he forced himself to, but because his mind felt calmer in the morning. The quiet hours before the world fully woke up became one of his favorite parts of the day. He began exercising more consistently. Reading became easier again. Instead of jumping between 5 different articles online, so he could sit with a single book for an hour without feeling restless. None of these changes were dramatic on their own, but together they revealed something important. When the noise fades, your mind naturally begins moving toward growth. One evening, Daniel sat at his kitchen table after finishing work. His phone lay on the counter across the room, where he had started leaving it during the evening hours. A notebook sat open in front of him. For the past few weeks, he had been writing down ideas about how he wanted his life to improve. Nothing complicated, just small observations about the habits that seemed to help him, and the ones that quietly drained his time. As he looked at the page, a thought appeared that felt both exciting and uncomfortable. What would happen if he took this idea much further? What if, instead of protecting only 2 hours each day, he created a much larger block of time dedicated to rebuilding himself? Not forever, just for a while. The idea sounded strange at first. In modern life, people rarely step away from the constant flow of updates, conversations, and digital connection. Being reachable at all times has become the default expectation. But Daniel realized something important. Many of the conversations, Notifications and social obligations filling his schedule were not actually necessary. They were simply habits that had accumulated over time. A message that felt urgent in the moment rarely mattered a week later. A trending topic that dominated a conversation on Monday was forgotten by Friday, yet those small moments of distraction filled hours of attention every single week. So Daniel asked himself a question that most people never seriously consider. What if he temporarily stepped away from the noise? Not completely isolated from the world, but intentionally less available. Fewer social obligations, less time scrolling, less energy spent reacting to things that had no real impact on his future. In other words, what if he disappeared for a while? Not from life, but from distraction. A few days later, he shared the idea with a close friend during a walk through a park. "I've been thinking about doing something different for the next 6 months," Daniel said. His friend looked at him with curiosity. "What kind of different?" "I want to focus almost entirely on improving myself," Daniel explained. "Learning, exercising, building better habits. I think I've been spreading my attention too thin for years." His friend nodded slowly. "That actually sounds like a great idea," he said. Then he paused and smiled. "But you know most people won't understand it, right?" Daniel laughed. He knew exactly what his friend meant. When someone decides to change their habits dramatically, the people around them often react in surprising ways. Not necessarily because they want to stop the change, but because the new behavior challenges what everyone else considers normal. If Daniel stopped joining certain social activities, some friends might assume he was becoming distant. If he spent less time online, people might wonder why he was suddenly so quiet. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized something important. The growth often requires a temporary period of separation from the patterns that keep you stuck. Athletes train for months away from the spotlight before competition. Writers spend long periods alone before publishing a book. Entrepreneurs often work quietly for years before anyone notices the results. The public usually sees the outcome. They rarely see the months of invisible preparation that made it possible. That realization helped Daniel make his decision. The goal was not to disappear forever. It was to create a protected season of growth, a period of time where his energy would be directed inward rather than constantly scattered outward. He began outlining simple rules for himself. Wake up early, exercise several times a week, read every day, spend focused hours developing skills related to his career, reduce social media to almost nothing, limit unnecessary social commitments. None of these rules were extreme. In fact, they were surprisingly ordinary. But their power came from consistency. Instead of trying to change everything overnight, Daniel committed to practicing these habits every single day for 6 months. There was no dramatic announcement, no public declaration online. Most people didn't even realize what he was doing. From the outside, his life still looked fairly normal, but internally, something important had begun. He'd made a quiet decision to invest deeply in his own growth. And decisions like that often create a powerful ripple effect over time. Because when someone chooses to focus their attention intentionally for months instead of moments, small improvements begin stacking on top of each other. Skills develop, confidence grows, opportunities appear, and eventually, the results become visible. But Daniel had not yet experienced the most surprising part of this journey. Because once he truly committed to this 6-month period of focus, he discovered something that many people never realize. When you step away from the noise long enough, you begin to hear your own direction much more clearly. Chapter 4. The Quiet Power of Daily Discipline. Once Daniel made the decision to dedicate the next 6 months to focused self-improvement, he expected the biggest challenge would be motivation. He assumed there would be mornings when he wouldn't feel like waking up early, evenings when he would rather relax than read or study, and days when the entire plan might feel unnecessary. But the first thing he discovered was unexpected. The real challenge was not motivation, it was consistency. Motivation feels powerful in the beginning. It appears suddenly, often after an inspiring idea or a moment of realization. It fills the mind with energy and makes change feel exciting. But motivation rarely lasts long. A few days later, the excitement fades. Life becomes busy again. Old habits quietly return. So that's where most attempts at personal transformation fail. Daniel realized that if his 6-month experiment was going to succeed, he could not rely on motivation alone. He needed something more stable. He needed discipline. At first, the word discipline sounded harsh to him. It brought to mind strict routines, rigid schedules, and constant pressure to perform. But as he began experimenting with new habits, he started seeing discipline in a different way. Discipline was not punishment. It was structure. Instead of waking up each day and deciding how to spend his time, Daniel created a simple rhythm for his mornings. He woke up earlier than usual, while the world outside was still quiet. The first thing he did was move his body. Some mornings it was a short run. Other days it was strength training or stretching. It's nothing extreme. Just enough to wake up his mind and body. After exercising, he spent time reading. At first, he struggled to sit still for long periods. His mind occasionally drifted toward the habit of checking his phone. But gradually, reading began to feel easier again. Books introduced him to ideas he had not considered before. Concepts about focus, habits, productivity, and long-term thinking. Each morning, those ideas slowly reshaped the way he viewed his time. One of the most important lessons he encountered came from a simple observation. Small actions repeated daily become powerful over time. A single workout doesn't transform the body. 1 hour of reading doesn't instantly change the mind. But when those actions are repeated consistently, the results compound. And a friend of Daniel's experienced this principle in a completely different area of life. His friend Marcus had always wanted to learn the piano. For years, he talked about it, occasionally watching tutorials online or practicing for a few days before losing interest. One year, Marcus decided to approach the goal differently. Instead of trying to practice for hours whenever he felt inspired, he committed to something much smaller, 20 minutes every day. At first, the progress seemed slow. The first few weeks were mostly spent learning basic finger movements and simple melodies. But Marcus stayed consistent, 20 minutes every day. After 3 months, something surprising happened. His hands began moving more naturally across the keys. Songs that once felt impossible started sounding recognizable. By the end of the year, Marcus could play several full pieces from memory. The transformation didn't come from occasional bursts of enthusiasm. It came from steady repetition. Daniel began applying the same mindset to his own habits. Instead of setting unrealistic expectations, he focused on building routines that were simple enough to maintain every day. Some evenings were dedicated to learning new skills related to his career. Other nights were spent reading or reflecting on the progress he had made. He also kept a small notebook where he tracked the habits he practiced each day. At first, the notebook seemed unnecessary, but over time it became one of the most powerful tools in his routine. Seeing the habits written down created a quiet sense of accountability. Each check mark represented a small promise kept to himself, and there were still days when the routine felt difficult. On one particularly long work day, Daniel returned home feeling exhausted. The idea of opening a book or studying anything new felt almost impossible. For a moment, he considered skipping his routine entirely, but then he remembered the simple rule he had made for himself. Consistency matters more than intensity. So instead of trying to study for a full hour, he read for 10 minutes. That small action might not seem significant, but it preserved the rhythm of his habit. The next day, returning to the routine felt natural again. This is one of the quiet secrets behind lasting change. People often believe success requires dramatic effort, massive bursts of productivity, or intense periods of motivation. But the truth is usually much simpler. The most powerful changes come from small actions, repeated so consistently that they eventually become part of who you are. After several months, Daniel noticed that many of his habits no longer required effort. Waking up early felt normal. Exercising felt natural. Reading in the evening felt more relaxing than scrolling through endless content online. And with each passing week, he felt something else growing inside him. Confidence. Not the loud, attention-seeking kind of confidence that tries to impress others, but a quiet confidence built on evidence. Every day he followed through on his commitments. He proved something to himself. He was capable of change. He was capable of discipline. And more importantly, he was capable of directing his life intentionally instead of simply reacting to whatever happened around him. But as the months continued passing, another realization began forming in Daniel's mind. The habits he had built were changing more than just his schedule. They were slowly changing the way he saw himself and the possibilities that might exist beyond the life he had been living before. Chapter 5. The identity shift that changes everything. As Daniel continued following his routines week after week, something subtle but powerful began happening beneath the surface. At first, the changes were mostly visible in his habits. He woke up earlier, exercised regularly, and spent his evenings reading or developing new skills instead of scrolling endlessly on his phone. But after several months, the transformation began reaching deeper. It started changing the way he saw himself. Most people believe habits are simply actions we repeat. Wake up early, go to the gym, study something new, drink more water, spend less time online. But habits are rarely just behaviors. They slowly shape identity. Every action you repeat sends a small message to your brain about the kind of person you are. If you consistently avoid challenges, the mind begins believing you are someone who gives up easily. If you repeatedly break promises to yourself, the brain starts expecting that pattern. But the opposite is also true. When you follow through on commitments, even small ones, you begin creating a different internal story. Daniel noticed this shift one evening while looking through the notebook where he had been tracking his habits. Page after page contained small check marks: reading, exercise, focused work sessions, skill development. None of those individual actions felt extraordinary, but together they represented something powerful: consistency. For the first time in a long while, Daniel realized he trusted himself. That trust didn't appear overnight. It developed gradually as evidence accumulated day after day. A promise made in the morning was a promise kept in the evening. And that reliability created a quiet but meaningful change in his mindset. He stopped seeing himself as someone who occasionally tried to improve. He began seeing himself as someone who followed through. This shift in identity is one of the most overlooked forces behind personal transformation. When people attempt to change their lives, they often focus only on outcomes. They want to lose weight, earn more money, develop a new skill, or become more productive. But focusing only on outcomes can create frustration. Results take time. Progress sometimes moves slowly. When people measure success only by the final result, they often become discouraged before the transformation has time to take hold. Identity-based change works differently. Instead of asking, "What result do I want?" the question becomes, "Who do I want to become?" A person who exercises regularly is not simply someone who goes to the gym occasionally. They are someone who sees themselves as a healthy and active individual. A person who reads daily does not just finish books. They become someone who values knowledge and growth. Daniel experienced this shift in a small but meaningful moment one afternoon at work. A co-worker mentioned an upcoming project that required learning a new marketing tool. Several people around the table seemed hesitant. The software looked complicated, and the learning curve appeared steep. Months earlier, Daniel might have reacted the same way, but this time his response surprised even him. "I'll take a look at it," he said. The words came out naturally, without hesitation. Later that evening, as he began studying the tool, he realized something interesting. He no longer saw learning as something difficult or inconvenient. It had simply become part of his routine. This is how identity gradually evolves. Small behaviors repeated consistently begin redefining what feels normal. Another example appeared through one of Daniel's friends, a woman named Rachel who had struggled with fitness for years. Rachel often described herself as someone who just wasn't athletic. She had tried joining gyms several times, but each attempt lasted only a few weeks before the routine faded. Eventually, she tried a different approach. Instead of focusing on dramatic transformations, she started walking every morning, just 20 minutes, nothing intense. But she made one rule for herself. She would walk every day, no matter how small the distance felt. At first, the habit seemed insignificant. But after several months, Rachel noticed something surprising. She had stopped describing herself as someone who struggles with exercise. She had become someone who moved every morning. That subtle identity shift changed everything. Soon, the 20-minute walks grew longer. She began trying light workouts. Eventually, she joined a local fitness class and discovered she enjoyed the challenge. The transformation did not begin with motivation. It began with identity. Daniel realized his own 6-month experiment was producing the same effect. The habits he practiced each day were not only improving his productivity or discipline, they were reshaping the story he told himself about who he was becoming. He was no longer the person constantly distracted by notifications and endless scrolling. He was someone building focus, someone building discipline, someone intentionally designing his life. And when identity begins shifting in that direction, something remarkable happens. New opportunities feel less intimidating. Challenges begin looking like invitations instead of obstacles. The person you are becoming starts influencing the decisions you make. As the months continued passing, Daniel felt that transformation strengthening. But the most interesting part of the journey had not yet arrived. Because once a person begins changing their identity, the outside world eventually starts noticing as well. Chapter 6. The moment people start noticing the change. For the first few months of Daniel's 6-month experiment, almost no one noticed what he was doing. From the outside, his life looked mostly the same. He still went to work, still met friends occasionally, still responded to important messages. There was no dramatic announcement, no public declaration about a personal transformation. In fact, that quietness was intentional. Daniel didn't want the attention. He wanted the space. Too often, people share their goals publicly before the work has actually begun. They post about new habits, announce ambitious plans, and talk about the changes they intend to make. But sometimes, that early attention creates a strange illusion of progress. Talking about change can feel almost as satisfying as making it. Daniel chose a different approach. Instead of announcing the journey, he focused on living it. Weeks passed, then months. Gradually, small improvements began stacking on top of each other. His mornings became more structured. His work became more focused. The skills he was studying in the evenings slowly strengthened his confidence in ways that weren't obvious to anyone else yet. But eventually, something interesting started happening. Other people began noticing subtle differences. One afternoon at work, Daniel was discussing a project with a small team. The conversation moved quickly, jumping between several ideas and possible strategies. At one point, someone asked a question about a marketing tool that most people in the room had barely explored. Daniel explained the answer clearly. The room went quiet for a moment. A co-worker looked at him and said, half joking, "Since when do you know so much about this stuff?" Daniel smiled. "Just been learning it recently," he replied. The comment seemed casual, but it stayed with him. Not long ago, he would have been the one asking those questions instead of answering them. A few days later, another small moment happened. During lunch, a colleague mentioned feeling overwhelmed by constant notifications and online distractions. The conversation turned into a familiar complaint about how difficult it was to focus in modern life. Without thinking much about it, Daniel shared a few of the habits he had been practicing: reducing notifications, protecting focused work time, reading regularly instead of scrolling. The response surprised him. Instead of brushing the idea aside, several co-workers became curious. "How do you actually stick to that?" one person asked. Doesn't it get boring? Another added. For the first time, Daniel realized that the habits which had quietly become normal for him now seemed unusual to others. But the changes weren't only happening at work. One weekend, Daniel met a close friend for coffee. They had not seen each other for a couple of months, and as they sat down to talk, the friend tilted his head slightly. "You seem different," he said. Daniel laughed. "Different how?" "I'm not sure exactly," his friend replied. "You just seem calmer, more focused." Daniel hadn't consciously tried to project that image, yet the internal changes he had experienced were beginning to appear externally. Confidence built through discipline often has that effect. It's not loud or dramatic. It simply changes the way a person carries themselves. Another interesting moment occurred during a family gathering. While talking with relatives, the conversation eventually turned toward work, goals, and future plans. At one point, someone asked Daniel what he had been doing differently lately. Before answering, he paused for a moment. The truth was simple. "I've just been focusing on improving a few things in my routine," he said. The explanation sounded almost ordinary, but internally, he knew those small routines had created a much deeper transformation than most people realized, because the biggest changes during those months had not been visible at all. They had happened in his thinking. He reacted less impulsively. He approached problems with more patience. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by challenges, he found himself analyzing them calmly and searching for solutions. These shifts created a new kind of confidence, not the type that depends on external validation or recognition, but the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you are capable of directing your own growth. Interestingly, the more Daniel focused on his habits, the less concerned he became about impressing others. That detachment created another unexpected advantage. When someone stops chasing attention, their actions often become more authentic. They make decisions based on long-term growth instead of short-term approval. People tend to notice that authenticity. And when they do, curiosity naturally follows. Over time, more friends began asking Daniel about the changes in his routine. Some were genuinely interested in improving their own habits. Others were simply curious about what had created such a noticeable shift. But Daniel understood something important. The transformation they were seeing now had not appeared overnight. It was the result of hundreds of small actions repeated quietly over months. Every early morning, every focused work session, every evening spent learning instead of scrolling. All those moments had gradually reshaped his mindset and abilities. And yet, despite all the progress he had made, Daniel still had several weeks left in his 6-month commitment. What he didn't realize yet was that the final stage of this journey would reveal something even more powerful. Because the most meaningful reward of focused self-improvement isn't just the habits you build or the skills you learn. It's the clarity you gain about the kind of life you truly want to create moving forward. Chapter 7. The clarity that comes from stepping away. By the time Daniel reached the 5th month of his 6-month commitment, something remarkable had begun happening. The habits he had once struggled to maintain now felt natural. Waking up early no longer required effort. Exercising had become part of his routine. Even the quiet hours of reading and learning that once felt unusual had become the most peaceful moments of his day. But the biggest change was not in his schedule. It was in his clarity. When Daniel first began this journey, his mind often felt crowded. Ideas, worries, notifications, responsibilities, and constant information competed for attention. Decisions felt rushed, and long-term thinking rarely had enough space to develop. Now, something different was happening. Because he had spent months reducing distractions, so his thoughts had more room to breathe. It was during one of his morning walks that he first noticed the difference. The sky was still pale with early sunlight, and the streets were quiet. Daniel often used these walks as time to reflect, without music, without podcasts, just silence. At first, those silent walks had felt uncomfortable. His mind would instinctively search for stimulation, something to listen to, something to check, something to react to. But over time, silence had become valuable. it created space for deeper thinking. On this particular morning, Daniel found himself thinking about a question he had avoided for years. What kind of life did he actually want to build? Before beginning his 6-month experiment, most of his decisions had been reactive. Opportunities appeared, and he responded. Work demanded attention, and he followed its rhythm. Social obligations filled his evenings, and he went along with the flow. There had been little time to step back and examine the bigger picture. But now, with fewer distractions and stronger focus, Daniel began seeing his life from a wider perspective. He realized that many of the goals he had once chased were not truly his own. Some had come from expectations, what society suggested he should want. Others came from comparison, quietly shaped by what people around him were pursuing. But the months of focused self-improvement had changed his priorities. He cared less about impressing others and more about building a life that felt meaningful to him personally. A small example of this shift appeared at work. Earlier in his career, Daniel had often felt pressure to say yes to every opportunity. Extra projects, additional responsibilities, meetings that filled his calendar from morning until evening. At the time, it seemed like the right strategy. Saying yes created the appearance of ambition, but during his months of deep focus, Daniel had begun seeing time differently. Every commitment carried a hidden cost. Time spent in one direction meant time unavailable for another. Because he had invested so much energy developing new skills and building better habits, he became more protective of his attention. He began asking himself a simple question before agreeing to something new. Does this move my life forward in a meaningful way? If the answer was unclear, he allowed himself to say no. At first, that decision felt uncomfortable. Many people fear disappointing others or appearing uncooperative. But something surprising happened. So instead of creating problems, the boundaries often earned respect. When Daniel committed to a project, people could trust that he would give it full attention. When he spoke during meetings, his ideas were thoughtful and focused. Quality replaced quantity. This clarity extended beyond work as well. He became more selective with his time. Instead of filling every free evening with random activities, he chose experiences that genuinely energized him. Conversations with close friends, time spent learning, or simply quiet reflection. One evening, during dinner with a longtime friend, Daniel explained some of the changes he had been experiencing. "It's strange," he said. "I thought this 6-month experiment would mostly help with productivity. But the biggest change is how clearly I see things now." His friend leaned back in his chair. "What do you mean?" "I mean, it's easier to tell what actually matters," Daniel said. "When you step away from constant distractions for long enough, your priorities start sorting themselves out." His friend nodded slowly. "That makes sense," he replied. "Most of us never really give ourselves time to think." That observation stayed with Daniel. In modern life, people often move so quickly from one task to the next that they rarely pause long enough to examine their direction. Days become weeks, weeks become months, and years pass while routines continue unchanged. But when someone intentionally creates space for reflection, focus, and quiet thinking, something powerful happens. Life becomes more deliberate. Decisions become more thoughtful, and the path forward becomes clearer. Daniel realized that the 6-month commitment he had made was not just about building habits or improving discipline. It had given him something even more valuable: perspective. He could see the patterns that once controlled his attention. He could recognize which activities drained his energy and which ones helped him grow. That awareness changed the way he approached the future. Instead of drifting through the next stage of life, he felt prepared to design it intentionally. But as the final weeks of his 6-month journey approached, Daniel began asking himself one final question. If 6 months of focused effort could create this much change, what might happen if he continued living this way far beyond the original experiment? Chapter 8. What happens after the 6 months end? When Daniel first decided to disappear for 6 months and focus entirely on himself, he thought of it as a temporary challenge. 6 months. That was the deal he made with himself. 6 months of discipline, 6 months of learning, 6 months of saying no to distractions and yes to growth. And after that, he assumed life would simply return to normal. But something unexpected happened as the final weeks approached. He realized there was no going back. Not because he was trapped in a strict routine, not because he had locked himself into a rigid lifestyle, but because the person he had become during those 6 months saw the world differently. One quiet evening near the end of the experiment, Daniel sat at his desk and opened the same notebook he had used since the beginning of the journey. What's inside were pages filled with small daily reflections, short notes about focus, check marks beside completed habits, occasional reminders written to himself during difficult days. Curious, he flipped back to the very first entries. Those early pages felt like they belonged to a different person. In the beginning, the notes were uncertain. Some lines mentioned struggling to wake up early. Others talked about fighting the urge to scroll through social media late at night. One entry simply read, "Hard to stay focused today. Almost gave up." Daniel smiled when he saw it. He remembered that day clearly. At the time, the 6-month commitment felt overwhelming. The distance between where he was and who he wanted to become seemed enormous. But the pages that followed told a different story. Slowly, the tone changed. The notes became calmer, and the check marks became more consistent. Small wins started appearing more frequently. Nothing dramatic, just steady progress. That was the moment Daniel understood something powerful. The transformation hadn't come from one big decision. It came from hundreds of small ones. Every morning he chose to get up instead of hitting the snooze button. Every evening he chose reading or learning instead of endless scrolling. Every time he protected a few hours of focused work instead of giving in to distractions. Those small choices, repeated again and again, had quietly built a different life. A few days later, Daniel met Rachel for coffee. Rachel had also been going through her own version of change. Months earlier, she had started a simple habit, walking every morning for 20 minutes. At the time, so she told Daniel, it was just a temporary experiment. "I'll see if I can stick with it for a while," she had said. Now, months later, the habit had grown into something bigger. As they talked, Rachel laughed and said something that made Daniel pause. "You know what's funny?" she said. "I used to think I was someone who struggled with exercise." "And now?" Daniel asked. "Now it's just part of my life." That sentence captured something important. Real transformation eventually stops feeling like effort. It simply becomes normal. Daniel realized the same thing had happened to him. Waking up early no longer required discipline. Reading regularly no longer felt like a task. Learning new skills had become something he genuinely looked forward to. The habits that once required motivation had become part of his identity. But perhaps the biggest change wasn't in his routines. It was in the way he thought about the future. Before the 6-month experiment, Daniel's goals were vague. He wanted to improve his life, become more productive, learn new things. But those intentions were scattered. Now his thinking felt sharper. Because he had spent months observing how he used his time and attention, he understood something most people rarely examine. Where your attention goes, your life follows. When attention is scattered across endless notifications, distractions, and random entertainment, progress becomes slow and inconsistent. But when attention is directed intentionally, even for a few hours each day, growth accelerates. Daniel had experienced that difference firsthand. So near the end of the 6th month, he asked himself a simple question. What if 6 months of focus could create this much change? What would happen if he continued living this way? Not in an extreme or obsessive way, just intentionally. Protecting time for learning, guarding attention from unnecessary distractions, continuing the habits that had already proven to work. The answer felt obvious. The 6-month experiment wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. Because the real purpose of disappearing for 6 months isn't to shock other people. It's to rediscover your own potential. It's to prove to yourself that change is possible, not through motivation or inspiration alone, but through consistent action. Daniel understood that life would still contain challenges. There would still be stressful days, moments when routine slipped, periods when motivation faded. But the difference now was confidence. He had evidence that he could change his habits, redirect his attention, and rebuild momentum whenever necessary. That belief created a new kind of freedom, not freedom from effort, but freedom from doubt. And once a person develops that kind of self-trust, something remarkable happens. They stop waiting for the perfect moment to improve their lives. They start creating it themselves. 6 months earlier, Daniel had disappeared quietly to work on himself. Now, without needing to announce it, the results were beginning to show, not just in what he accomplished, but in how he thought, how he acted, and how he chose to spend the most valuable resource he had: his time. And the truth is, anyone watching this right now has the opportunity to begin the same journey, not by disappearing forever, but by giving yourself the rare gift of focused time. 6 months. Long enough to change habits. Long enough to reshape identity. And long enough to discover a version of yourself that might surprise even you. As we reach the end of this journey, let's take a moment to step back and reflect on everything we explored together. This video began with a simple but powerful idea. What could happen if you disappeared for 6 months? Not from your responsibilities, not from the people who matter to you, but from the noise, the distractions, and the habits that slowly drain your potential. Through Daniel's story, we saw how real transformation rarely begins with dramatic changes. It begins with small decisions made quietly, waking up a little earlier, protecting time for focused work, choosing learning over endless scrolling, replacing distraction with intention. At first, those choices feel difficult. They require discipline. They require patience. And most importantly, they require you to believe that small improvements today can build a very different life tomorrow. But as the months pass, something remarkable begins to happen. The habits that once required effort slowly become normal. The discipline that once felt exhausting becomes natural. And the person you are becoming starts to look very different from the person you were when the journey began. In Daniel's case, the biggest transformation wasn't just productivity or skill development. It was clarity. When he stepped away from constant distractions, he finally created space to think. Space to ask bigger questions about the kind of life he wanted to build. Space to notice which habits were helping him grow and which ones were quietly holding him back. And that clarity changed everything. It helped him focus his energy on what truly mattered. And it helped him build confidence through consistent action. And perhaps most importantly, it helped him develop trust in himself, the belief that he could set a direction and follow through. That's the real lesson behind the idea of disappearing for 6 months. It's not about isolating yourself from the world. It's about reconnecting with the version of yourself that gets buried under constant distraction. Because the truth is, most people don't lack potential. They lack uninterrupted time to develop it. Imagine what could happen if you gave yourself 6 months of intentional focus, 6 months of protecting your attention, 6 months of building habits that support your growth instead of sabotaging it. You don't have to change everything overnight. You don't have to be perfect. But all you need to do is begin with small decisions that move your life forward, one day at a time. Maybe that means reading for 20 minutes each evening instead of scrolling endlessly on your phone. Maybe it means waking up a little earlier to create quiet time for thinking or planning. Maybe it means learning a new skill that could change your future. Whatever it is, the key is consistency. Because when small improvements repeat themselves over weeks and months, they quietly reshape your identity. They transform the way you see yourself, and they open doors you may never have believed were possible. So if this message resonated with you today, consider giving yourself that opportunity. Not someday, not when life becomes less busy, but starting now. You might be surprised by how much can change in 6 months when your focus finally belongs to you again. Thank you for spending this time with me and being part of this journey. Your attention is incredibly valuable, and I truly appreciate you choosing to invest it here. If this video inspired you or reminded you of someone who might need this message right now, consider sharing it with them. Sometimes a single idea at the right moment can completely change the direction of someone's life. And if you enjoy deep, thought-provoking audiobook-style content like this, stories and ideas that help you grow, think differently, and build a better future, make sure to stay connected for the next video. Because the next story might be the one that unlocks the next level of your life. Until then, take care of yourself. Stay focused on what truly matters. And I'll see you in the next video.